皆さんこんにちは。バイトミゲームのチャンネルです。Japan is home to some of the most influential game designers. Think about people like Shigeru Miyamoto, who worked on the Mario and Zelda games, or someone like Tetsuya Nomura, who made the Kingdom Hearts series, or someone like Yoko Taro, who made the Nier Automata and other Nier games. But there has always been this one game designer that has piqued my interest the most, and that is Hideo Kojima, who made the Metal Gear series and also more recently Death Stranding. He's also probably, apart from Yoko Taro, one of the most eccentric game developers, often putting himself in the game and also having his games just be, honestly, the best way to describe it is sometimes batshit crazy. And he has this very quirky game designer personality, but some of the work he makes is some of the best games that I've ever played, and his games have also just received a lot of critical acclaim in general. Now that I'm here in Japan and I'm actually in the place where Hideo Kojima grew up, I figured this would be a perfect time to learn a bit more about the guy, see what he does as his day-to-day life and try to replicate it as close as possible. Truly live like Hideo Kojima for as much as I can. And I figured I would document it all and I would talk to you guys about it as well, because there are some very odd things that maybe you don't fully expect that he does. A few years ago he made some tweets where he documents basically how his week looks like, what he does during his work days, what he does for leisure and such. And also went through his own book that he wrote, which is The Creative Gene by Hideo Kojima. It's basically less of a book and more of a collection of smaller articles and such that he's written, but it still gave me a really good idea into who is he as a person and what does he do, what are some of the things that have influenced him to make the games that he has. So if we look at how does Hideo Kojima work, well, his work ethic is, the best way I can describe it, very Japanese. As he himself says, I basically work all day except for weekends and holidays. And he does mean truly all day, from waking up to almost going to sleep. 8-hour work weeks, not really a thing here. It's a common problem in Japan in general, the work culture. But I figured that, hey, for 1 week I can live with working a bit more maybe. And honestly, now that we're so close with less than a month from the release of our own game, Forge Industry, I could use all of the time basically to keep working and improving our game as we're approaching that deadline. Now, doing this was definitely not the easiest, as maybe you've heard it in one of my previous videos. I'm a big proponent of just doing shorter hours, but actually using a lot of deep work for those really creative tasks, especially something like game design is something that I don't think you can do for too long in a row, because I have the problem that my brain shuts off after like 4 or 5 hours of really focused work. Of course, if I wanted to work like Hideo Kojima, that wasn't enough. So I rescheduled my work a bit and I did my deep work still in the morning, my very intense work. And then I looked at what are some things that we need to do for our game that are maybe a bit more brain dead tasks, such as implementing new items, which is just doing a bunch of clicking and things like that, working through UIs, and it's very tedious and boring. But it's something that, you know, you can do with 10% brain capacity almost. You just put on some music and you keep at it for a few extra hours. So this was how I basically worked a lot more. I wouldn't recommend it for long though, because this is not sustainable to do. And then once he has finished his workday, he usually just chills in the evening, either reading some novels. This is actually something that he talked about in his book, which surprised me a bit, is every day when he walks from the office back to his home, he goes into a bookstore and he buys a random book. He doesn't really look at it too much, because his idea is that if I buy 10 books, at least one of them will have something that will change my mind. And I don't have that much budget to buy a book every day, and I also need to bring them back to Belgium. But I do understand, as someone who reads a lot of books as well, I do understand where he comes from. And then apart from reading, he also often watches movies in the evening. He says that his work is very influenced as well by some OG movies such as the original Blade Runner or Akira or Mad Max 2. And that's what I did as well. I usually don't watch that many movies, but I try to make some time now during the evenings, and I did watch some of the movies. In my case, I watched the original Blade Runner, followed by Blade Runner 2049, and then also 2001: A Space Odyssey. That's also one of his favorite movies, and I had actually never seen it, so I've also seen that one now. And I do think that movies are one of those great ways, I talked about it in a previous video as well, inspired leisure. Watching a movie can inspire you to work on your game as well, especially if you're a game designer like him. You need your mind constantly being fed new pieces of input to put into your own personal world and own personal game. I have that with, for example, some movies like Avatar, which is more recent. When I watched that movie, I was also really inspired and I got a lot of ideas for world building, for how the game would look basically, or something like a Dune also had this for me. Because definitely I didn't grow up on like the old movies such as Taxi Driver or 2001: A Space Odyssey. So for a zoomer like me, it's always a bit harder to watch those movies. And then on the weekends, well, he basically relaxes a bit. He often just goes to museums, he goes and watches movies in the cinema, which I also did, or he just reads a bit more. What I also did, which was described in his book actually, is I took the train basically. Okay, sounds a bit weird, but here in the Osaka area where he grew up, we have a railway company called the Hankyu, which is, as he described it, a very cute kind of train and very popular. So I took the train from Osaka to Kyoto, the Hankyu line, and I also listened to music. That's something he does a lot as well. He just listens to music and he lets his mind flow basically. One thing that I do there as well is, if you're making your own game, I would suggest that you make a Spotify playlist or whatever playlist of the music that you want the mood of your game to be. So if you want to make a cyberpunk game, you have a playlist with a lot of, for example, darker techno music and more of that industrial vibe. Or if you are making a fantasy RPG, you know, you put in a lot of the fantasy folk songs, and you just have this playlist to put you in the mood of when you're working on your game, to feel like you're in the game as well, and to really let your imagination flow, because that's what you need as a game designer, a lot of imagination. And with that, my 7 days were basically over already. I was considering at first, do I do this challenge for 30 days or for 7 days? But I can tell you now, his work ethic, I couldn't sustain for 30 days. I do need a bit of a more chill period from time to time. And I do think that definitely he goes very hardcore, especially if you're purely someone who's designing games and not programming. I think you should tone it down just a bit on how intense it is. But if you are in a crunch period, well, like we are a bit, sometimes you just have to do the work basically, whether you are doing it optimally or not. If I don't do it, it's going to be even worse. And I do think that it's definitely very interesting to have learned a bit more about Kojima. If you haven't, I suggest you play some of his games as well. I really enjoyed Death Stranding and also Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. Just for the memes basically almost, you can play that game. If you don't know him, it gives you a really good insight into how quirky he is. One other designer that I was considering also living as is Yoko Taro, who made the Nier Automata series and the Nier games, but I couldn't find as much information about him. So if you think that I should maybe try and revisit it, but do this with another game designer, maybe Yoko Taro, maybe someone else, leave it in the comments down below and I'll see if I can find out more about them and make a video similar to this with whoever you suggest as well. That's basically it. If you're new here, we're a game development studio making our own videos, a bit more of the entertainment ones like this, where I just talk about my experiences. Or we have our own devlogs where we work on our own games and share our experiences there, or we have some more of a tutorials and tips. If that sounds like something that interests you, be sure to go ahead and leave us a like as well as subscribe, as it really helps us out and you get this cool content twice a week delivered to your subscription box. That's all I really have to say. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!